Okay, we are discussing now the we finished last week. We did all of chapter 12, all of Parakid Beis last week, and we started Parakid Gimel. And Mesilat Yesharim is kind of, I mean, he doesn't say it, the author, but in a certain sense he does actually, that we're focusing now in the realm of Chasidus, even though Chasidus itself is actually one of the midos, just the realm of going above and beyond. Up until now, we were focused on being careful of just mitzvah observance, to be zariz towards mitzvahs, to be zahir, to guard ourselves from sins in a more broad sense, to be naki, to have nikiyas, and focus on every detail so that we don't sin in any way whatsoever. And now we're in the realm of going above and beyond, about doing things that are not strictly prohibited, but doing things that will protect ourselves, as we'll see, from getting into the realm of danger, where we might then come to sin. And this is precious. For those who weren't here last week, I ended by saying there's a footnote here quoted a mashal from Rousseau Salanter. I'm not going to go through the mashal part, but I'll just say the nimshal of what he said is that even though we might not be on the madriga to necessarily do this per se, we might be, but even if we're not there, he says it's always important to learn this stuff because you could always take points here and there. He says a person doesn't have to, even though it's meant the sefer to go in order, there's a progression. You shouldn't jump in theory from 1 to 4 to 9. You should go in order. So even if we're starting right now, we're reading stuff that's on a higher madrega. He says a person, nonetheless, when a person is spiritually starved in a sense, and a person is seeking anything, then just grabbing whatever you can is worthwhile. So even if there are things, even if overall this might be very tough, but if there are nikudos or points that are relevant and are things that we want to try to achieve, then we certainly should go after it. So he says follows: Hine klal haprishos humasha amru zechronu levracha. That precious in general is what the Chachamim say in Gemara Yevamos and Kaf Amud Aleph. Kadesh atmacha b'mutar lecha. You should purify yourself, make yourself holy with that is even mutar to you. V'zogsi horasa shel hamila atma, precious. And this is the connotation of the word precious, of to be parush, is specifically to remove yourself not from something that's usher, but from something that is mutar. Rotza lomar, that is to say, to remove yourself and distance yourself from something, from an item, a thing, where you forbid something to yourself that is a davar heter. And the kavanah should be that you don't become blemished in the actual isser itself. Right? This is, and one could say, this is the notion of chumrah, in a certain sense. Sometimes, meaning sometimes chumrah is I want to be machar, so I don't want to sin. So this could be separate in a sense, right? A person, like we'll see, like a person not having meat, let's say, so often, that's not necessarily considered, it's not considered a chumrah. It doesn't fall into that category. But chumros do fall potentially into the category of precious. And it's interesting to note, I don't believe he says this. I think I read in a footnote at some point, but it's interesting to note that when it comes to nidarim, when it comes to, let's say, hataras nidarim, which we think about like Erev Rosh Hashanah, doing hataras nidarim, the formal sense, but when a person does something and they are no longer able to keep it, need to do hataras nidarim, that's actually not for a mitzvah. We only, if there's something that's explicitly commanded to us to do or not to do, you don't do a taras nedarim for that if you can't do it. That would be just sinning. But if there's a chumrah that a person does, let's say, just for example, over the last maybe decade or so, I started keeping Rabbeinu Tam after Shabbos. And so there were times, I think 2 or 3 occasions, where I was playing music for, like, I was being paid to play music on Motzei Shabbos, and it has to start, of course, right after Shabbos, and they want musical Havdalah, and I didn't really, obviously, like, I had a choice to say no to the whole gig, but I wasn't going to do that. But I did, in those circumstances, I did Hataras Nadarim, before Shabbos. Can't do it on Shabbos, so I did it before Shabbos, and because I accept the Rabbeinu Tam myself as a chumrah. And once you do something 3 times, then something like becomes part of you. Let's see. So continuing on, so he says, "Ve'inyan shakol davar shiyuchal leivali mimenu gramas ra." That when you have an item where something could lead and could come from that something that is bad, even though right now nothing bad is happening, but kol shekain she'einenu ra mamish, and even if it's not mamish bad, yirchak v'yifrosh mimenu. That's something that a person wants to be porish from, right? There are many, many examples. I'm scared to give examples because, I mean, just I won't necessarily be someone like keeping it, but I'll use an example even though I don't do this. I certainly at times will watch TV. Let's say there are people, let's say, much firmer than me that will never, let's say, watch sports because they know that at times the camera might go to like a cheerleader. And if it goes to a cheerleader, then he could have an improper thought. That's a very holy thing, right? So it's a harchaka to make sure that, there's nothing wrong with watching sports, but knowing that it'll probably happen where they'll go show the cheerleaders, like there's something that will probably lead to something bad. That's just like one example of this. And he says there are 3 levels to this. 3 levels in general to sin. Yesh haisurim atmam, the actual sins themselves, things which are prohibited. V'yesh siagosehem. And then there are the siags la Torah, right? So let's say muksa, for example. The whole notion of muksa is iser derabana, right? Many laws of hilchos shatna. I mean, yes, many. There are many laws that are deraisa, many laws that are derabana, but there are a lot of siyagim that are related to hilchos Shabbos, and those are there to protect the Torah law. I give a mashal. I believe I said it once in the Shiur, but I don't think I've said it for months. I'll just say it now. I give a mashal to students that if you go to New York City subway, so there are people who sometimes stand right near the edge of the platform, and it's dangerous. And so the city doesn't want people to fall in. So what they do, they paint approximately, let's say, 2 or 3 feet before the end of the platform is yellow paint, because you shouldn't step and stand in the yellow paint. So even though if someone does stand there, you can be totally safe, but take a step back and they'll protect you from the danger of falling in. So to the Chachamim put the yellow paint, they put siyagim to protect us from falling into violating the Isser D'Oraisa. So those are still, the siyagim are still obviously usher, but it's not the level of Isser Mamish. Of an Isser D'Oraisa. And these, meaning he's explaining the siyagim, are decrees and things that we have to guard, protect ourselves from, that the Chachamim B'nai Yisrael put in place. V'yesh harchekim shemuta kol parush u'parush lasos theos kones besof shalo ubone giderim la'asmo. Then our level that we're discussing right now is even beyond that, where there are things that each person should take upon themselves to be porish from things and to put up gedarim for themselves, not gedarim that the chachamim put up for us. Those are at a higher degree, but these just for oneself. To everyone knows their own weaknesses, and people should try their best to protect themselves from those. Dahainu laniach min ha'terim atmam shlo nesru l'kol Yisrael. The livrosh mehem kadesh yamorchak min hara herchek gadol. A person forgoes certain heterim for themselves, because then they will distance themselves from the actual sin. So it's an added precaution, one would say. And some of the stuff could be more towards machshava, more towards like leading to meisim. And now this is probably the most important part related to this. Probably also, I think, the most interesting, which is the following. I'll just say the beginning outside and then we'll read it, which is the following question. It might sound nice, everything we're saying, but it seems I'll actually, I'll say a different route. Okay, I just want to introduce this with something else, with a brief story. Okay, I was once in a situation where I was the passenger in the car, and I was speaking to the driver, and we were driving in Washington Heights. It was crazy traffic as always, and we were coming back from school, and and I remember the light was about to turn red, and I told, because we had to go like towards the diagonal, so we could have gone straight or left. So I said to the driver, make a left, and they made a left, and all of a sudden we see sirens behind us, and the cop gave her a ticket because it was a no left turn. She was crying, bad times. It was not a date, although I did date her in the past, but it was a colleague. I think there were other people in the car. It was carpool, but it was a bad time, bad situation. Okay, so she turned left because I told her to turn left. Now she was looking also. She saw the matzav, I guess, but she wasn't. She didn't see that sign. I obviously didn't see that sign, and I was the one who basically told her to go left. And and I was going to pay her for the ticket. I told her I'd pay her for it. I felt 100% like it should be on me because I was the one that caused it. But at the same time, I was wondering, A, what the halacha is, and B, and here's the why I'm saying this now, the more important part is, let's say the halacha is, and it happens to be, I believe the halacha is that it was not upon me to have to pay. So let's say that is the case. So in YU at the time, this is now probably somewhere like 7, 8 years ago. So this is when Aryeh Leibowitz was there the first time. Aryeh Leibowitz is now back at YU. He's the head of the Smicha program, but he used to give a shiur once a week there, and I love listening to him online. I could count on one hand the amount of times I've heard him in person, and because I saw him like that night, and I went up to him and I asked him a question. He gets thousands and thousands of questions. He was a brilliant man. Let me ask him this question. So he said, it's not upon me to pay. So I said, what if I feel I should pay? Now here's the question. Am I allowed to pay if the Torah and the halacha is I'm putter from paying, that it's upon her to pay because she was the driver, she was the one who makes the choice. So it's kind of like this, meaning and let me now explain I'll explain the question here, and then I'll go back to that answer if you'd like. But the question here is, Hakadosh Baruch Hu set up a system of things that are prohibited, and the Chachamim, in their infinite wisdom, said these, let's just say, few hundred things you should also not do because it'll lead to a prohibition. It might lead to you actually sinning. So now am I allowed to say, "Oh, I'm better than them. They forgot one. Let me do this also." How am I allowed to do that? Right? It seems wrong, actually. He's going to say, like, it should seem wrong to be porish, to add upon stringencies. That's one angle at it. There are other angles. So that's why so I went through Aryeh Leibowitz. I said, am I allowed to do something where the Torah says, no, you're putter, you don't have to pay? Am I allowed to pay? So he answered, and he said, I forgot who he quoted, I apologize, but he said that when the Torah says you should do this, like here's the din, that's the bottom level. And if a person wants to go beyond, they can. 100% you can, but you don't have to. It's like it's not the din. So that was the case. So let's see how he phrases the question here, the Ramchal. V'im tomar, if you'll say, minayin lanu lios mosifim v'holchem ba'isurim. How are we allowed to add upon isurim? Says it much better than me, right? Very to the point, direct and to the point. How can we add isurim to the Torah, to the Chachamim? Harei Chachmeinu Zachrona Bracha Amru, says the Gemara Yishalmi Darim Tet Lo Dayecha Masha Asra Torah. Is it not enough what the Torah prohibited? Shata Bala Esar Alecha Dvar Machirim, that you now are going to come to add upon more Yisurim to yourself. So that doesn't seem very nice, right? Meaning the Chachamim in the Gemara discourage such a behavior, to say that now you're gonna be firmer than Torah. Shatab, sorry. And that which the Chachamim saw in their wisdom, where they needed to prohibit a person to guard a certain action, and the things that they didn't prohibit, you know why they didn't prohibit? Because they said it's fine to do. Go, do it. Don't worry. And now you're going to come and you're going to add Isurim that they weren't gozer upon. The Ode, here, the Ode, she'ein gvul l'davar hazeh. He says that's the first big issue. He says the next issue is like the concept of ein l'davar sof, like there's no end to the matter. Meaning when we have one of the beautiful components of the Torah is things are finite. We know what we are allowed to do. We know we're not allowed to do. There, of course, are situations that come up where we're not sure which category it falls in. You know what I mean? When someone has a shaila, it's not where like, oh, here's something totally new. Let's figure out now we have to do this. It either falls into this category or that category. It's either prohibited or it's permitted. But we have guidelines for what to do. And he says, if a person is making their own stringencies, then in the davar sof, you could just keep going because there's nothing actually boxing you in. Then a person is going to be tormenting themselves and they're just going to be prohibiting all pleasure in the world. And in the Yerushalmi and Kedusha and Daled Yud says, that a person is going to in the future be judged by a Kadosh Baruch Hu and have a din v'cheshbon upon all things that we saw with our eyes, things that we coveted, things that we wanted. Where let's say you saw a beautiful fruit and you said, "Oh, I don't want to give myself the pleasure." So Hashem, after we die, is going to say, "How come you didn't eat that? How come you didn't eat that apple? I made that apple for you. Why didn't you get pleasure from it?" We're going to be held accountable for things that we don't get pleasure from, says the Gemara, right? So this seems to totally, like, I mean, he's making the point against Precious right now. Number one, right, what we said that like you're better than the Chachamim, and number two now is that you're prohibiting things that Hashem actually wants you to derive benefit from. And I guess number three, which was kind of before number two, somewhat, which is the ein l'davar sof. Like you could just keep going. There's no end to how much you could prohibit upon yourself. Rasmechu akra, and the pasuk in Kohelet Beis pasuk Yud says, "V'chol asher shalu einai lo atzalti mehem." That any desire that my eyes saw, I didn't deny. Meaning I indulged in that which was permitted to indulge upon. Right? Obviously, we know Shlomo Melech was not one to necessarily be porish, right? Someone who had many wives and tremendous wealth, right? So that's considered. He says it's not a bad thing. So how do we get around this? What's the answer? I mean, the Ramchal, obviously the parak is about being porish, and it's considered a midas chasidus. It's considered a great thing that's above and beyond. But how do we get around this? Hatshuva the answer is ki aprishas vaday tzarach umuchrach v'izhiru alav chachmei zechron lebracha. That precious is necessary. 100% a person should be porish. Humash shenemar, as the Torah says, Kiddushim to you should be holy. And it says Prushim to you should be porish. That's what it means. Like the Ramban famously says, you shouldn't be an aval b'rshus haTorah. You shouldn't be someone who's gluttonous and who's like an abomination in the face of the Torah, where a person indulges, says the Ramban, a person shouldn't indulge constantly in hana, in benefit, in like activities that a person just gets pure pleasure from. You shouldn't do them constantly. It's not good to eat meat every single day, all the time. Obviously, I think it's one of his examples. There are other things, but a person should be porish in theory, or practically. Od Amru, Gemara Tanis and Yud Aleph Amud Aleph says, "Kol Yoshe B'Tanis Nikra Kadosh." That a person who sits and fasts, he's called Kadosh. Kal v'chomer mi Nazir. Now there's a Kal v'chomer from Nazir. That the Kal v'chomer, I don't think if it says it here. I can't remember if it says it. I don't think it says it, so I'll just say it. The Kal v'chomer is that if a Nazir is called Kadosh because all they're prohibiting from themselves is having wine and grapes, right? In theory, which is mutter, and they're prohibiting that upon themselves, they're called kadosh. A person who's fasting is prohibiting himself all food and drink, so certainly he should be kadosh. Od Amru, furthermore, says in Sikta Rav Kahana, Tzadik ochel l'sova nafsho. A tzaddik eats to satiate his soul, right? We don't eat because we want to enjoy the steak. We eat because our soul needs nourishment, right? So it's not about the pleasure involved, it's about the necessity for survival. When it says that, who's it referring to? It's referring to Chizkiyahu, and it calls him, it's noteworthy that it calls him a tzaddik. Why is that relevant? Because Amru Allah, it said about Chizkiyahu, Sheshtei agudo shel yarak litra, that he basically had a small amount of food each day. Shel basar hayu malden lefana b'chol yom. Sorry, agudo shel yarek, shtei agudo shel yarek, litra shel basar. That's how much food he had every day. Malden lefana b'chol yom. Yisrael malikin v'omrim. And the Jewish people would mock him and say, "Zem melech, this is a king. You're having such small amount of food." But the proof that it's good to be poresh is that the pasuk calls him tzaddik for his low quantity consumption throughout a day. But Odamru, it says in the Gemara Ksubos on Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph, Rabbeinu Hakadosh. By the way, let me before we continue just with another proof. Actually, I'll read the two more proofs and then I'll share something. And we'll probably stop, but read the two more proofs. So Od Amru says in Ksubos and Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph, Rabbeinu Hakadosh b'shas misaso zakaf eseret osa Amar. This is an intense story. That Yehuda Nasi, who when he died, he held up his fingers, and he said, "Goloi v'yadol fanecha, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, you know, and you could attest, Shalom ne'esim na'ol mazeh filu be'etva ktana shali. I didn't get any pleasure from this world with any of my fingers." Wow, super intense line. Od Amru, the last, he says, Ad sha'adam ispal al divrei Torah she kansu b'soch meyav. That a person is davening for the Torah to enter him. And they daven that food does not enter his intestines. It doesn't mean that you should starve. But you're saying I shouldn't necessarily overindulge in that. Let me make sure I absorb all the Torah. These certainly teach the necessity and the greatness of precious. And he says, now we need to explain the questions and here's what I was going to say. And I think it's better probably to start this part next week, but he didn't answer it yet, right? Everything I'll keep the recording going, but I'll stop the share. But everything he was saying until now. So we started with the strong questions of you're going above the chachamim, in the davar sof, Hashem wants you to benefit from the world. And then we said, so how do we answer those? Oh, but here's a source you should be parish. Here's a source you should be parish. Here's a source you should be parish. That doesn't answer those questions. That just makes it a contradiction. You know what I mean? We still haven't resolved. A resolution would be, oh, now we understand why that is not applicable or what case that was referring to. We haven't taken those off the table. We've just shown that you should be porish. So that's the question right now that we're going to deal with next week. How could we reconcile these strong statements from Chazal that you should make sure to get benefit, and you're going to be judged by Hashem if you don't get benefit from pleasure. And how could you go above and beyond the Chachamim? And at the same time, so many praises of precious, of someone being called a kadosh, and Rabbi Huda Nasi, you didn't get pleasure from his fingers. Like, how could we do this? So Bez Hashem will continue that